a research scholar from Maharashtra. On the behalf of Indian Research Scholars Association, I welcome you all on this virtual platform. The topic of this session is fundamentals of thesis writing. For this session, we have an eminent speaker, Dr. Sonika Gupta ma'am. She is an associate professor at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Madras. Welcome, ma'am. I would like to give a brief introduction of our speaker. Ma'am completed her PhD from JNU in 2004. Her area of interest is international relations. Currently, she is working as an associate professor in Chinese Studies and Global Politics at Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, Chennai. All the participants are eagerly waiting to hear from you, ma'am. I kindly request you to take the virtual stage and enlighten us with your words. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shubhangi. And thank you, Vikash, for inviting me. When Vikash and I were deciding which topic to speak about, I realized that there are a number of speakers who have spoken about the more academic parts of how to do research. What is methodology? How do you do a critical analysis, etc. I thought it might be useful, given that this is a multidisciplinary group, to actually talk about practical side of how to write a thesis. And the practical side of how to write a thesis is, of course, informed by the academic requirements of the degree of the PhD. And this is not something that can be understood in the lack of other academic training. But the fundamentals of thesis writing is something that is also something you cannot do without, even if you've done all of your research in the way that you want to do, even if you're very passionate about your research, even if you're very committed to your research. There are certain requirements of a PhD degree which you have to fulfill. And for that, I think it's sometimes in our PhD programs, we don't pay sufficient attention to it. We assume that this is something people will learn, or this is something people should already be prepared with and come when they enter a PhD program. Unfortunately, it's a little bit like, assuming that teachers at the graduate level, teachers know how to teach, because at school level we demand a bachelor's in education to be able to teach. That means you're taught how to teach. But in colleges, in universities, that's not a requirement. It's assumed that you will know how to teach. So similarly with PhD scholars, this is a bit of a expectation sometimes which undermines the process. That you should already know how to do research. You should already know what is the requirement of a PhD degree. What is the requirement of actually writing a thesis. So I thought it might help to focus a little bit on that. And I'd be happy to take questions at the end. If you have any questions throughout the session, you can keep putting them in the chat box. And at the end of my presentation, I'll be happy to answer a few questions. Okay, so the first thing that I want to flag for all the research scholars here is that the PhD program is a time-bound program. In any university, it's a time-bound program. So this is usually the timeline that is expected of research scholars, or this is a timeline one should aspire to keep to, because this is not something that is negotiable within the program. So if, for example, you have exceeded the time given to you at any of these milestones, what ends up happening is you have to adjust your the goals of your thesis. You have to adjust the amount of field work you want to do. You have to adjust the amount of data you want to collect. So this is something I will come back to at the end of the presentation as well. Now, this might look a little daunting, right? But let's break this up year by year and take a look at it and see where you are, and each one of you can plot where you are in this journey. You don't have to plot this year wise, you can plot it milestone wise. So in the first year, in most PhD programs in India, we would have a coursework. Usually this coursework would be of 2 semesters. Now, how to get your coursework to be the foundation of your thesis? And this is something I always tell my students. Thesis writing doesn't begin once you've done your field work, once you've done your data analysis, once you've there is no period in the thesis, no period in your PhD degree where you say that today I will start writing my thesis. No, your thesis writing begins with the very first year. Your thesis writing begins through coursework. So how does thesis writing begin? Through coursework. Now, I am aware of the fact that in many universities, coursework is a little ad hoc, or it's not exactly geared towards the needs of individual PhD scholars. But the purpose of coursework in most universities and institutes is twofold. The first is you have to clear the coursework to be able to be confirmed in the PhD program. So it's an evaluative purpose. The second purpose is to train you in the domain that you are in. Now, use your coursework in a way that it allows you to start looking at the literature in the field domain topics that you want to work in. So as far as possible, all the assignments for your coursework that you will be asked to do should be, in a manner of speaking, focused towards the literature that you want to include in your literature review. How does one go about doing that? Suppose the coursework is not addressing your needs. Suppose the coursework is on areas that are not key to your research. Even then, for example, let's say my area is international relations, so most of the examples I will give will be from international relations. Let's say your area is, let's say, something like looking at the current crisis in Gaza. Okay, and the PhD coursework does not address anything with regard to that. So suppose a teacher has asked you, one of the professors has asked you to write an assignment looking at different theories, explaining different theories of IR with regard to a project or with regard to a process, event, or phenomena in international relations. Pick something that is very close to your topic, which is Gaza. Suppose one of the other professors has asked you to do a historical analysis of something that is related to that particular course. Try and see, ask the professor if you can do an historical analysis that's related to as closely related to your topic. So use the first year of the coursework to start your reading, and what you write in that should be always written with a purpose of looking at it as this is going into my literature review. And read, I cannot emphasize this enough, please read outside of whatever the coursework requirement is. Because in the first 2 years is when you have the freedom to read across disciplines. You have the freedom to read across topics. So as far as possible, read outside of what is demanded of the coursework. Make sure that you are familiarizing yourself with what is the current existing work on the topic domain or area that you want to work on. So if you take to first amateur, that how can I compare when I'm asked to appear for examinations, when the courses are not exactly geared to my topic. But you also have the opportunity at that point in time to make sure that you can focus whatever the coursework is to your topic to the extent possible. Once you do that, you will make across the different courses you're doing, you'll begin to make connections across different courses you're doing, with the topic or area that you want to work in. I'm not saying your literature review should be complete in all respects, but your familiarity with your literature should be of a very high percentage. So 75% of the review completed does not mean that it's written up. It doesn't mean that it has been seen by your guide as a complete literature review, but your familiarity with it should be at least 75%. Once you have moved into that, once you completed your coursework, in the second year, you are usually required, different universities have different requirements, but in the second year is when you're usually required to present a research proposal, which is the place where, if you haven't completed your literature review, you will take at least the first 6 months of second year to actually decide what goes into your research proposal. But if you have used your first year to familiarize yourself with the literature, you can then start writing your first chapter, which is your literature review chapter. And that goes into your research proposal. So all PhD milestones, different universities have different requirements. Some universities do not require a lot of written work to be presented at different PhD milestones. Some require it. For those who require it, please use each one of your PhD milestones to present something written in detail. These are not things that you will say, I will write later. No. If you're only required to make a presentation, first write what you have to present. Write it up as a write-up, as a chapter, as a potential chapter, and then make a presentation based on that. Okay? Your research proposal is a very, very important milestone in your journey, because it's your research proposal that tells your doctoral committee that you have identified a research gap. So you cannot identify a research gap till your literature review is complete. If you're going to wait till the second year to start doing your literature review, your research proposal will automatically get pushed to the second half of your second year, might even get pushed to the third year, right? Which will delay your timelines. If your research proposal you're ready to present with familiarity with your literature in the first half of the second year, you can actually start to get feedback on that from your supervisor and your doctoral committee, and then start making plans for data collection or fieldwork as might be required by your discipline. Okay, so by the end of second year, if you have figured out what is the literature, you figured out what is the research gap you are addressing, the third thing that will automatically come out of it is how are you going to do this? So your methodology, research gap and methodology chapter basically is why you're doing what you're doing and how you are going to do it. Okay, so by the end of second year, there should be on your computer 2 sizable chapter drafts. Chapter 1, literature review. Chapter 2, what is the research gap and how you're going to do it. These are the 2 things you anyway have to present in your research proposal. So your research proposal actually becomes your chapter 2. Okay, once you have started, once you have in discussion with your supervisor and your doctoral committee, figured out what your research gap is and presented to them what your methodology is, that is the time to venture into data collection, whether it's field work, whether it's archival work, whether it is working with primary sources. This is the year where it is very easy to let time pass by without much visible output. Because these are the 2 years, the third year and the fourth year, in which there is very little structure to a PhD student's day. If you're in the field, it is, if you're doing actual field work, that gives some amount of structure. If you're doing archival work, being present in the archives. If you're working with primary material, which you can access online, where you don't have to go to a physical space to do it, you have to be a little bit more careful of how to structure your days and to make sure how to make your day productive. So in this year, make sure that you set yourselves very small but achievable goals. So a large goal like by the end of third year, I will have my empirical chapter is not a very productive way of looking at it. What you should do is set yourself goals for 3 months and please build in enough time. Always build in enough time to take a break every 3 months. Every 3 months, take a break. Even if it is a week's break, make sure you take a break. So every 3 months, say, this is something I will share with my supervisor. This is the data I have collected. What that will do is, what these discussions will allow is, it will allow you and your supervisor to discuss the data you're collecting and relate it back to your research gap and your methodology and place it within the literature review. Right? If you wait till the end of the year to say, oh, I haven't generated enough data, I will wait till the end of the year to share this with my supervisor, that will not be a very productive way of looking at it. There might be concerns, and I'll speak a little bit about this a little later also. There might be concerns that, oh, I haven't done enough. So then you have to identify the reasons you haven't done enough. There can be multiple reasons why you haven't been able to collect data. The primary reason can be a health concern. In all universities, there are provisions for making sure that if you have health concerns, whether they are with regard to physical health or mental health, there are provisions for making sure that you're given extra time, that it's built into you. But never assume that the PhD is a 5-year program or a 4-year program, so I will anyway have time. I think that is something that you have to be very conscious of, that the time which you're not working is not time that you can recover later, unless there's a good reason for it. And in most cases, there are exceptions for health reasons, there are exceptions for personal reasons. So, and PhD is a long-term program. You people are all at different life stages. You might need time for different things in your life to take maybe 6 months off, maybe to take care of somebody, maybe, to move on with other life goals. So then make sure that the process part of it with regard to your own thesis, you keep on top of as far as possible. So in the third year, make sure you have at least 4 drafts of your data collection chapter, your empirical chapter, to share with your supervisor, and not wait till the end of the year to share 1 draft. Because this will allow you also to do course correction. In case you're not going in the right direction, this will allow you to have this discussion with your supervisor, or if required with your DC, to see how it can be, how the problems that you are getting probably stuck by, or problems that you have not anticipated, or problems that, or maybe something interesting came to your attention which you had not considered while identifying the research gap. How do you want to expand your focus? How do you want to contract your focus? Do you want to bring in a new method? All of these things, this will allow you to do. If you say every 3 months, I must have a written draft to show. Then you move into the 4th year. Again, this is again a year in which you can lose your way very easily because there is no structure to this year. In the data collection period, at least you have an understanding that I have to either go for field work, or I have to be in the archives, or I have to do some primary material collection. You might go abroad, you might be talking to people, you might be conducting interviews, you might be handing out surveys. The 4th year is the data analysis year, in which people usually kind of tend to isolate themselves a little, because you have generated all of this data, or the other possibilities, you've not generated enough data. And in both cases, how to move forward on that becomes a challenge. So in the 4th year, my suggestion to you, all of you, would be to make sure that actually in the 3rd year itself, start identifying conferences at which you can present your work. You can choose a very small part of your work, a very, very focused part of your work. Look for a conference that allows you to share that and your preliminary analysis in a conference setting. These can be student conferences. These can be conferences where you and your supervisor might present together, because that gets you out of that isolation, that gets you feedback. And I understand work that is ongoing can be very daunting to present. But this is where your supervisor has to support you. Ask for this support. It is your right to ask for this support. You want to present at a conference, make sure you share the abstract with your guide, you ask for feedback on it. If you have time to, and if your supervisor has time, make sure that you give a written up paper, not just a presentation, a written up paper to your supervisor to take a look at, on which you base your presentation. Use your peer group, your cohort to make a presentation, to ask for feedback from them. In the fourth year, it is very important to be engaged with a larger community of scholars, which includes people who are already working on this, more established scholars, faculty, your peer group, to be able to share your work. These days, there are a lot of concerns amongst people that I don't want to share my work because I have concerns that my work might be plagiarized. But there are ways of making sure that your work is not plagiarized. And one of this is to present at conferences. At conferences, what is presented is always recognized as work in progress, and it is not to be cited. Also, make sure that you're not circulating your work. You should not circulate your work to people. You should give them maybe an abstract of your work, but don't circulate your chapters, don't circulate your data. Okay. And again, in the data analysis part, this is where most of your consequential work of your thesis will come in. So in this year, make sure you keep in close touch with your supervisor. With your supervisor, work out a timetable for the first 3 months, then the next 3 months, every quarter. Work out a timetable of which aspects of the data you will actually present to your supervisor that will then finally come together as the entire empirical chapter. So this is the format we follow in IIT Madras. That there's a literature review chapter, there is a research gap and methodology chapter, then the 2 empirical chapters, and then you have a conclusion. In the 5th year, which is when I find increasingly in many places, many universities from where I get the thesis, people tend to leave the writing of the thesis to the 5th year. 5th year is for finalizing the thesis. 5th year is not for writing the thesis. If you're writing your thesis in the 5th year, then you will be very stressed about what to do. The quality of work is going to suffer. Your supervisor is not going to work according to your timeline because you are the one who's rushed, not the supervisor. In the 5th year, what is required of you is that you should be confident about your empirical chapters to be able to make changes in your literature review and research gap. And always feel like, I feel, this is my personal way of doing this, that writing the introduction at the end is a very useful exercise because then you know how to introduce your work. If you write the introduction to your thesis in the beginning of your journey, you're not sufficiently informed yet. So your introduction is also fairly superficial. The conclusion obviously has to come in at the end. And 5th year is when you make sure that everything is structured well. That from your introduction to your first chapter to your second chapter and so on, your thesis is well written and well structured. And it will amaze you, it will surprise you that how much time structuring for thesis takes. Structuring of any piece of academic writing. So this is not something you should not have time for. Okay. Now, what is a literature review? Is it different from a literature search? So when I'm telling you by the first year, you should have 75% of your literature review completed. I think it'll be useful to know what is the difference between a literature review and a literature search. A literature search is you just type something into Google Scholar or some other search engine, and you get a list of readings on the topic that you entered. That can generate your bibliography. That's not a literature review. So a literature review, what is it not? It's not a list of articles and books on your topic. So when you're writing your literature review, just to say, I have read this on this topic, or this is the most highly cited work on this topic, is not a literature review. It's not also a summary of the books and articles that you've read on your topic. And this is what I find most people leave their literature review as, that these are the authors I've read, this is what this author says in this book, or this is what this group of authors says in that particular article, and your literature review is literally just a summary of, or it is snippets of book reviews and article reviews. That's not what a literature review is. What is a literature review? A literature review is the story of your domain. It's a story of the topic that you're working on. That who first started working on it? Why did they start working on it? And then who are the other scholars who joined in the conversation? Why was it required that more than one person do this research? And in every field, there is more than one person doing the research. So this, and then and we are looking at literature reviews, I'm assuming most of your social sciences scholars, our literature reviews are talking about hundreds of people doing the same kind of, looking at the same topic or area. So then a literature review primarily is to categorize what are the different lenses all of these people are using and say, okay, fine, let's take an example of Indian foreign policy. So people who are doing research on Indian foreign policy, how many people, or not how many people, that's not the important but what are the different ways in which they're looking at Indian foreign policy? So are people looking at Indian foreign policy as a post-colonial state, or are people looking at Indian foreign policy of India as a state that has a particular set of national interests, or are people looking at India in South Asia, or are people looking at India as a global actor? So what are these different lenses? And what is in each lens, what are the one or two primary arguments? Then, once you've made this categorization, then your literature review is a conversation between these different lenses, which means that today, if my topic is to look at is Indian foreign policy independent of concerns of human rights? Let's say, is it independent of concerns of human rights, or is it contributing to concerns of human rights? Then I have to look at everybody who's written on Indian foreign policy and human rights and see what their major arguments are. And then see how are these arguments talking to each other? How are they related to each other? So basically, your literature review is your record, the way you have recorded what the scholarly literature on your domain and your specific topic is. Okay, so at the end of the day, when at the end of the first year, when you have familiarized yourself with all of what is written in this domain, you will then come to an understanding of what is it that scholars who are writing on Indian foreign policy are writing about. Now, this I cannot emphasize enough. In a PhD journey, the most important thing for you to do is to record. So if you've read an article, if you've read a book, but you've made absolutely no record of it, if you've not annotated it, if you've not organized it in some way, and if you've not preserved it in some way that you can retrieve it, that is labor lost, because you're going to have to do it again. So do not read anything without annotation. What is annotation? You can make physical notes on the particular piece of text you're doing. There are lots of softwares available. If you're reading in hard copy, you can write on that, but you cannot just leave it at that. You must maintain separate documents for each and every part of the thesis that you're reading for. So first annotate, then organize it. What does organize mean? Organize means the same thing, that go back and categorize. So once you've got your categorizations, you will then see some patterns emerging within the literature that you're reading. You will see some patterns emerging. So once you've read for about 6 to 8 months, when you have a new reading which you've not read before, or a new article that has come up, or a new book that has come up, you will actually be able to locate it within that literature and say, this book actually disagrees with this and this, and adds this particular aspect to this conversation. Retrieval. It is very, very important to make sure that you organize all the work that you do in a manner that you can easily retrieve. Again, this document, if you maintain of everything that you've read, separated into categories, these are separate documents, your retrieval will be that much easier. It will also allow you to write up your literature review in sections and refer back to the notes that you're making. Now, this might look like a whole lot of work. This might look like work that you say, oh, but this is just extra work. Actually, this is work that will simplify your chapter writing process. Because when you're sitting down to write your chapter, you cannot have a whole folder on your computer in which you have a lot of readings that you've read. Each reading you might have to open separately to look at your annotations, to look at remind yourself what each scholar said about that. Instead of that, if you already have a document prepared, you already have the beginnings of an emerging structure. So retrieval is very, very important. Then, what is the type of literature review you want to write? This is something you have to discuss in consultation with your guide. Primarily, there are two types. There are chronological ones and thematic reviews. This depends on what is your approach to your research. If a chronological review is required by the kind of research you're doing, then that is the better fit for you. Thematic reviews are much more complex to write, but they are also much more rewarding in terms of fleshing out what your research gap is, right? So in a chronological review, what a chronological review allows you to do is to map the history of your field or domain, right? And it will give you a very good understanding of what has been important in your field and what has attracted the maximum attention of researchers. Now, if you want to do something that addresses questions that have already been asked, then your research gap is something that you have to locate either in the theoretical or in the methodological field. I'll talk a little bit about that. If your chronological review does not, at the end of it, allow you to identify a research gap, that means that the topic that you've chosen has been sufficiently dealt with. Thematic reviews are reviews that allow you to do what I spoke about here, which is the conversation between different lenses. A thematic review is also it is also a little more it's rewarding, but it's messier to write. So you should give yourselves more time if you're attempting a thematic review. If you've already categorized the literature in your first year and you're in consultation when you start writing your literature review chapter, this is a good conversation to have with your guide, that should we write a chronological review or should we write a thematic review? What a thematic review will allow you to do is to help you categorize the literature and help you locate the different critiques and help you build a conversation between them. Again, the purpose of the review is also the same, should allow you to actually identify a research gap. Okay, if it doesn't allow you to identify a research gap, then your review is not going in the direction it should be going in. Or the topic that you've chosen is something that has already been addressed, and you need to refocus about how you can do that differently. Okay, so what is a research gap? Now, this is something I've put in red because this is something I constantly see. What is new to you is not necessarily new in the field. A lot of things will be new to you as you read. A lot of things will come across as fresh knowledge to you. But because you're reading on it, that means it's already been addressed. So what is new to you is not necessarily new in the field. Don't be in a hurry to put into your literature review or an identification of your research gap. There isn't sufficient research on this because you are not familiar with what is the research over there. Okay. So what is a research gap? There are three types of research gaps. One is an empirical gap, one is a theoretical gap, and one is a methodological gap. I have given examples from what I am most familiar with and some others. So empirical gap is a new area that is unexplored, right? Now, in today's day and age of this information overload, that is not something that is very easily to come by, right? But for example, I'll give you an example of what some of my students have worked on and I have worked on. One of my students worked on Tibetan exile cinema. There was a lot of work on Tibetan cinema, but nobody had worked on the Tibetan community in exile in India and the cinema they produce. So that became an empirical gap. While there was a lot of work on Tibetan visual representations, there was a lot of work on Tibetan cinema generally coming out of Tibet or in other locations. Nobody had worked on filmmakers that were working in India, the Tibetans who are in exile in India. So that became a research gap. Secondly, the second thing which I've mentioned is the Tibetan rehabilitation policy. So this is something, again, this was a policy that was introduced by the government of India in 2014, and till 2015-16, nobody had worked on it. So this became a research project that I undertook because there was a gap here. There was a lot of work, already existing work on the Tibetans in India, how they have rehabilitated, how they have built settlements, how they have reconfigured their identity in exile, but there was no work specifically on this particular policy initiative. So this became something that I could work on for a few years and present as new research. Other examples, not from my field, could be when I was a student, Indian writing in English in the 1980s was a very big field because there was very little being written on it till the 80s and early 90s. Or something more recent, COVID-related research. So, for example, you want to look at the impact of, let's say, school attendance post-COVID. You want to look at impact of office attendance post-COVID. So these are areas that are so recent. These are phenomena that are so recent, there will be an empirical gap. But an empirical gap cannot be read back into history. So, for example, you cannot say things like, I'm going to do an analysis of Indian foreign policy and I'm going to do an analysis of India's approach to warfare. And the first thing you write in your literature survey or in your research proposal is, there isn't sufficient research on it. People have started to use this line as there isn't sufficient research on it as a justification for wanting to do research on that area. But what it betrays is that you haven't sufficiently familiarized yourself. The second type of gap is a theoretical gap. A theoretical gap is one in which the event process phenomena that you're studying has a lot of existing studies on it, but it hasn't been studied from a particular approach. So, for example, one of my students is doing a feminist analysis of India's peacekeeping missions. Or another example which I can give you, which I'm familiar with, China's Belt and Road Initiative as an international institution. So there is a lot of work on that particular issue that you want to do, but a particular type of approach, and that particular type of approach should have something substantive to contribute to an understanding of that. So why do a feminist analysis of India's peacekeeping missions is the first question, then you would have to satisfy. Or why look at BRI as an international institution? Can it be looked at as an institution? What is the explanatory potential and value of looking at BRI as an international institution? Okay. The third thing is a methodological gap. The methodological gap is a new research design. So, for example, you look at something that has not been looked at through a particular type of approach or a method. So you want to build a story of Chinese economic history through Chinese literature. That you want to look at literature from different periods of Chinese history and see what were the different milestones in Chinese economic history and how they were reflected in literature. Or you want to look at, let's say, something like climate change and folklore. So you look at one particular district or area or region, and you look at folklore from that area and see whether climate change is beginning to actually make its way into folklore. Okay, Vikash, I'm assuming that I am audible.
Yes, ma'am, you are audible, but you can take more time, ma'am.
Yeah, I'll just take another 10 minutes. Okay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Finally, this. Pay attention to referencing. Referencing is something that cannot be done at a later stage. And as I have put on the slide here, referencing and writing are not parallel, but integral processes. They're not even parallel. It's not like today I will write this paragraph and tomorrow I will reference it. No, you reference as you write. Why is that important? The practical reason for that is, if you don't reference as you write, you run the risk of plagiarism. You run a very high risk of plagiarism. The second and the more important reason is that referencing is not just about putting in a footnote about who you're referring to, which author you're referring to. Referencing is about connecting back to the literature that you have read to make the point that you're making, and this displays to the person who's reading your work that you are actually familiar with the process of making an argument, that you know where your argument is going. So if you say that I will do referencing once I've written my a chapter, or I've written, God forbid, not the entire thesis, that is a very counterproductive way of writing. Relevant referencing is actually the best indicator of your process. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, if you know which category of argument you are responding to, which critique you're responding to, and you can actually refer back to the person or the scholar who's doing that, that is in writing the same thing. If in a conversation you can talk to people about, no, this scholar says this and another scholar disagrees with this person, and this is my view on it. When you're writing it, referencing is basically that conversation. So do not ever leave referencing to the end even of your day. You reference as you write. It might look at this point in time a little disruptive because most people would like to write what's there in their mind. So do not leave referencing more than 2 paragraphs to a later stage. Once you've written 2 paragraphs, take a break and reference it if it needs referencing. And I would say at the beginning stages of your thesis writing, over referencing is better than under referencing. And fortunately, you are of that. You're all of that generation where you have access to absolutely wonderful referencing management tools like Zotero or Mendeley. Please make sure that you train yourselves in using these. It takes literally 2 days to train yourself to learn how to use these, to get started on these. And a tool like Zotero can do so much more than just build a bibliography. It can actually make connections for you with cross-referencing. You can actually use Zotero as your record system. You can use Zotero to maintain a retrieval system, and it is something that will immensely benefit you. So make sure you train, and this is all available online free. So make sure you use Zotero or Mendeley or some other referencing management tool that you are familiar with. There are new ones which I'm not familiar with. So make sure that you do this. Okay. This is a very important part of PhD, and I feel this does not get addressed in any formal training or any professional environment. And people are just, everybody is just assumed to know what to do with feedback, how to take feedback, how to process feedback. And this is something I feel is a lacuna in our PhD trainings. So what very briefly I would like to tell you about this is, feedback is an integral part of your PhD journey. It's both an obligation and a privilege. So it's an obligation for your supervisor. Therefore, it is also your right to demand feedback. If your supervisor takes time to give feedback, then you must respect your supervisor's time and build in enough time that if you've given a chapter or a piece of writing, it might not come back to you as quickly as you want. But work with the timelines of your supervisor. And similarly, your supervisor should also respect your timelines. For those who don't get enough feedback, this can become a hampering, factor in how to move forward. But there's also the flip side. There are many who get rattled by feedback. If your supervisor has taken the trouble to go through your draft, whether it's a chapter draft, it's an essay, it's a data set, and has given you detailed feedback, please treat it like a privilege, because it shows that your supervisor is actually taking interest in your work, is invested in your work, and is committed to you doing your thesis well. So if you get a lot of feedback, it can look very daunting. So for example, a lot of the people, including me, we all use track changes to give feedback. So if you get your draft back and it's full of red notations, or things have been shifted around, the structure of what you've done has been, it can look like that your draft has been mutilated, right? So the first thing I would suggest to you, all of you, is don't react to feedback immediately. Read it, put it aside for at least 12 to 24 hours, and then go back and read it again. Please separate the feedback from the relationship you have with your supervisor. If you have a great relationship with your supervisor, do not expect that a draft that you have given will come back with minimum corrections. If you have a good relationship with your supervisor and your draft comes back with extensive correction, that means your supervisor is actually contributing to improving your thesis. If your draft has come back with minimum correction and you're satisfied with it, that is not a problem. But if you're not satisfied with it, please follow up if there is space in your relationship with your supervisor. Also remember, feedback is course correction. That is why I said in your third year and your fourth year, please don't wait for the supervisor to ask you, where is your draft? Every quarter, make sure you have an updated draft to give. Because if you wait till the end of the year, what you will be required to do will be something you might have to start from scratch, and you might not have time for it. That is much more demoralizing than getting a lot of feedback on a smaller draft. And if the feedback looks overwhelming, break it down. Break it down into what is the feedback about the research part and what is the feedback about the writing part. There are usually these two types of feedback, the research part and the writing part. Okay. And I understand that, when you are writing and giving something, you've spent a lot of time on it, you've spent a lot of energy on it, you're very invested in it, and you would like some amount of validation on it. But some supervisors just work with drafts and give you feedback on what needs to be worked on further. That doesn't mean that what you have written, none of it works. So ask what worked. Okay? Make sure you ask what worked. If you've not got that feedback, go back and ask. And have that conversation. I've understood this, and this. I would like to also ask, what is it that worked, so I can build on that. And the one thing is, if in the month of January you've given a draft and your supervisor has given you some feedback on it and you've acted on that feedback, and in the next draft, which maybe you give in the month of May, you have given the draft back and the supervisor has changed something in the portion that you thought you worked on, please don't be demoralized, because playing around with the structure of a chapter or a thesis is a continuous process till you finish. So don't look at it as, oh, this is moving backwards. No, it's not. And I think what most supervisors would look for is, once they've given some feedback, try not to make, especially the writing feedback, try not to make those mistakes again. Okay. And if there is feedback with regard to the research and you don't understand what a comment or a change means, always ask. Make a list of things and ask for a meeting and say, can I discuss this? Because I would like to understand this better. I would like to work on this to make sure that I'm moving in the right direction. Okay. The other thing is, these days there are lots of online resources that help you how to process feedback and all of that. Seek that help. There are a lot of videos. There's a lot of resources which people put out about what feedback means, how to look at it. Sometimes you do need a little bit of help when maybe your chapter has come back with too much correction and you're feeling demoralized. Always seek some online help or help from your peers. Deadlines, integral part of the PhD process. Deadlines should not be treated as elastic, but you should decide your milestones. And once you've decided what your milestones are, stick to it. Don't treat deadlines as times in which you have to be highly stressed. Because I find that this is something that is become a part of the PhD journey, that a PhD journey has to be stressful. That this has become a performance of a PhD scholar's life, that I am very stressed. If you're not stressed, then you're not doing good work. I don't buy into this. Deadlines are there for you to structure your work. Deadlines are there to ensure that you are meeting the requirements of your PhD program. Deadlines are not there to make you feel like you are failing. So, and every deadline is a opportunity for feedback. If you treat it like this, hopefully your approach towards it will be a little bit more constructive. Second is, say you've met your supervisor and the supervisor has said that after a month you make these changes or you generate this data and you meet me. Now 2 weeks into that deadline, you're stuck and you don't know what to do. Don't wait for the month to be over and then go see your supervisor. If you're stuck and if you're genuinely stuck after having tried, please approach your supervisor before the deadline and have a talk about where you're stuck. Because you need help, so you need to ask for help. That's your supervisor's job, to point you in the direction of getting out of places where you feel that you cannot make progress. The other thing is, don't wait till your draft is perfect, till a piece of writing is absolutely perfect. Because sometimes what ends up happening is we convince ourselves that, oh, this is not good enough to give, so I will not give it now. So now I need more time, so now I will take more time. And then that becomes a loop that never ends. And for those of you who have been, who have been very productive, who have been writing very well, who got very good feedback, for them also I would say, don't aim for perfectionism. It's exhausting and it's counterproductive. PhD is essentially a journey of learning how to do research and producing a good piece of research at the end of it. If you invest too much into perfectionism in your work, you will not allow yourself to seek the feedback that you need, and you will keep pushing the feedback till a time it's too late to even incorporate it. Okay. So finally, this is, I think, very important for all of you to pay attention. I'll say something very briefly about this because you're all familiar with it. AI is something that I'm sure all of you are considering using as some amount of input into your work. AI is a very enabling tool. For example, Zotero is an AI tool. Google Scholar is an AI tool, right? It can definitely increase in efficiency. One thing it can definitely help a lot with is language skills. So if you have ideas that you want to put down, but you feel your language skills are not, they're not keeping pace with your thinking, with your critical work, don't fret over that. There is a lot of AI that can help immensely with language skills. And unfortunately, in our country, sometimes language skill is something that is taken as a mark of actual research work rather than just skill. So make sure that you seek those things. There's Grammarly, there's many more others. AI can also help you in your literature review immensely. So for example, it can help you to start the search for a research gap. But you must remember, it's very limited in its output. So it'll give you very broad brush kind of feedback. So don't bank just on that. If you do that, you will run into trouble because you will be reproducing something that is not sufficiently familiar with your own field. You'll produce a research gap, which might not be a research gap. You might think it is, but it's not. And AI definitely cannot replace critical thinking. There is absolutely, at least till now, there is no, I don't know what will happen 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line, but till now, it is not something that can. So if you're using AI in your writing, I would suggest don't do it. Because AI will take you in particular directions, which will then lock you into those directions without you having sufficiently given enough time to exploring the whys and hows of your own research. And AI also runs a very high risk of plagiarism. So, for example, in IIT Madras now, our regular plagiarism check includes a check for AI writing. If you've not written it, nobody else should read it. If you've not written it, if you haven't taken the time to write, nobody else has the obligation to take the time to read it. So if it comes up as AI writing, there's an immediate disqualification, even parts of your thesis. AI is generative. So remember, it's generative. It's not creative. So don't make it a backbone of your writing. Don't make the mistake of ever making it a backbone of your writing. Use it as some kind of a enabling tool. Okay. Now I want to come back to this table that we started with. Hopefully it makes a little bit more sense to you now why the timeline is the way it is and why this timeline is something that you should adhere to. Okay. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your delivering such an insightful and informative session. Your expertise and knowledge you shared have truly enriched our understanding. Now the session is open. If any participant wants to ask question, you can ask.
Okay, so I will read the questions. There is one question right now.
Okay.
There is a question from Arpan Preet saying, thank you for the 4 to 5 year plan. It gives me confidence that I'm somewhat right path, but sometimes we seem to be carried away to compromise quality under peer pressure. As we see our batchmates completing their PhD within 3 or 2.5 years. How do you deal with that? Arpan Preet, all I will say to you on this is, nobody else should decide the timeline for your PhD. You should decide. Certain kinds of research, certain kinds of PhD programs in certain universities, if they are allowed to submit within 2 years or 3 years, all power to them. But if you feel that you want to finish first rather than do what is required, if you are able to do good quality work in 3 years, well and good, very good. But if you feel that you're compromising on quality, then remember, you're doing a PhD to be in academia. Your PhD is the first thing that you will introduce yourself as once you enter the academic market. And it is also the first thing that you will speak about as you go through promotions in the academic field. If you're going to compromise on quality on that, you've already compromised on your success in the field. Peer pressure to complete early is related to what is everybody's life goal. If you have pressure from home to finish early, if you have certain family circumstances to finish early, that is absolutely valid. But if somebody else is going to actually finish early and get a job before you, and you feel that you don't want to compromise on your research, then I think you're taking a very considered and a very mature decision. So that's all I can say in this regard.
Yes.
Any other questions? The questions.
Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am. You have said, ma'am, I'm audible.
Is that Indu? Yes.
Yes, sir. Ma'am, you have said while referencing, you have said the word over referencing, under referencing. What do you mean by that? Over referencing and under referencing?
Okay. So, for example, when you're writing, let's say you're writing a chapter, right? Now, you have quoted a particular author in your first paragraph, and you're making the same point in the 5th or the 6th paragraph. Now, just because you have quoted the person in the first paragraph or made a reference to the person in the first paragraph, while you're writing, you're like, okay, but I know who is saying this. I know whose argument this is. I know whose critique this is. So I don't need to reference it here. No, don't do that. Put the entire reference. Don't put
okay, we can repeat the name. You are saying now?
I'm saying yes. But I'm saying this as a writing practice. When at the end you're finalizing your thesis, you will clean all that up. Okay?
Okay, ma'am.
In the beginning, if you say no, I know who said this, I know whose argument this is, whose critique this is,
yes,
then you use that reference. Because remember, you will be cutting, pasting portions and putting them somewhere else. Your guide might be doing it, so you will lose that reference.
Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Over-referencing. This is what I mean by over-referencing. Kekasha has raised a hand. Kekasha?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. Good afternoon, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is, I am just confused in that introduction chapter. Accept my variables, or suppose my topic is the job satisfaction of teachers. So accept my variables, what we can also add in our introduction chapter.
So that is why I have suggested that introduction should be written right in the end. At what stage are you? At what stage of PhD writing are you?
Stage actually that I have completed 18 months, and in these 18 months I have completed my review chapter also and introduction also, and I'm completing my data also. But right now आगे बढ़ती जा रही हूँ, फिर थोड़ा पीछे पीछे कंफ्यूजन भी है.
आपका जो वेरिएबल्स का क्वेश्चन है वो आपके रिसर्च मेथोडोलॉजी वाले चैप्टर में आना चाहिए, इंट्रोडक्शन में नहीं. इंट्रोडक्शन हमेशा, मेरा सजेशन ये है, आई एम श्योर देयर आर पीपल हु डू इट डिफरेंटली, बट मेरा पर्सनल सजेशन ये है, इंट्रोडक्शन हमेशा आखिर में लिखिए, क्योंकि इंट्रोडक्शन आप पहले लिखेंगे तो आपका इंट्रोडक्शन इज नॉट इन्फॉर्म्ड बाय द वर्क यू आर गोइंग टू डू इन द रेस्ट 3 years दैट यू आर देयर इन द प्रोग्राम.
ओके,
तो पहले अपना लिटरेचर रिव्यू चैप्टर लिखिए,
वो करिए.
उसके बाद आप अपना रिसर्च गैप लिखिए, मेथोडोलॉजी लिखिए, अपना डेटा कलेक्शन चैप्टर लिखिए, डेटा एनालिसिस चैप्टर लिखिए, अपना कंक्लूजन लिखिए, और लास्ट में अपना इंट्रोडक्शन लिखिए, क्योंकि आपको पता है अब अपने इंट्रोडक्शन में क्या कहना है.
क्या कहना? ओके.
अभी अगर आप डिसाइड करेंगे इंट्रोडक्शन में क्या कहना है तो वो बहुत सुपरफिशियल होगा.
हाँ, अच्छा, यही वजह है कंफ्यूजन की. ओके, ठीक है, थैंक यू मैम.
Any other questions?
And participants, you can also ask question in the Hindi, no issue. Ma'am will try to address question.
Okay, I think Vikash, there are no more questions. So, acha.
Bablu Mandal have raised hand.
Yes, Bablu Mandal has raised a hand, and then after that Kekasha again. Yes, Bablu.
मैम गुड आफ्टरनून मैम.
Good afternoon.
मैम मेरा 2 सवाल है. एक मैम, जो लिटरेचर रिव्यू करने के लिए मैम जो टॉपिक रिलेटेड जो लिटरेचर है ना, वो ऑथेंटिक लिटरेचर सर्च करने के लिए प्रॉपर सर्च इंजन क्या है मैम? और सेकंड क्वेश्चन है मैम, एनोटेशन सॉफ्टवेयर बेस्ड क्या है मैम?
सेकंड क्वेश्चन दोबारा बोलिए.
एनोटेशन सॉफ्टवेयर मैम करने के लिए बेस्ट सॉफ्टवेयर क्या है?
एनोटेशन करने के लिए क्या है? सॉरी, मुझे आपका पूरा आवाज टूट रहा है.
सॉफ्टवेयर पूछ रहे हैं, सॉफ्टवेयर, बेस्ट सॉफ्टवेयर कौन सा है?
सॉफ्टवेयर एनोटेशन के लिए क्या सॉफ्टवेयर यूज कर सकते हैं?
यस मैम.
सो द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन इज, पहला क्वेश्चन
मैम, ये जो सेशन है वो बहुत हेल्पफुल होगा मेरे थीसिस सबमिट करने के लिए.
आई एम वेरी ग्लैड.
इस प्रकार जो आप सेमिनार कर रहे हो बहुत हेल्पफुल हमारे लिए, तो थैंक यू विकास सर.
You're most welcome, Bablu. So for annotation, Zotero is an amazing resource. Annotation के लिए Zotero use कीजिए. मैं Zotero use करती हूँ, तो I recommend that. लेकिन और भी बहुत सारे सॉफ्टवेयर होंगे. I think there is Paperpile which people use. Google Workplace भी यूज करते हैं लोग. बट अगर आपको कोई सॉफ्टवेयर नहीं भी यूज करना है, तो उसका भी तरीका मैंने बताया है कि आप जो भी आर्टिकल पढ़िए, जो भी किताब पढ़िए, उसका जो नोट्स बनाइए, वो किताब पे मत बनाइए, वो आप एक सेपरेट डॉक्यूमेंट में बनाइए जो आपका रनिंग डॉक्यूमेंट है. तो उस रनिंग डॉक्यूमेंट में अगर आप देखिए, अगर आप 3 हफ्ते के लिए, 4 हफ्ते के लिए यू आर रीडिंग ऑन लेट्स से द कास्ट equation in a particular region, okay, you're looking at caste inequality related to income inequality. So उसमें आपके categorizations होंगे, आप पढ़ेंगे about caste, you read about income. So caste के लिए एक separate document बनाइए, income के लिए एक separate document बनाइए. And once you start writing these documents, you will see these will become foundations for your, आपके chapters का foundation इधर से ही आएगा. वो आपका काम बेकार कभी नहीं जाएगा. आपका एक और क्वेश्चन था, आई एम सॉरी, आई फॉरगॉटन व्हाट योर फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन. पहला क्वेश्चन क्या था आपका?
क्वेश्चन था मैम जो पहला क्वेश्चन था मैम जो सर्च इंजन मैम, बेस्ट सर्च इंजन फॉर रिव्यू करने के लिए जो है ना.
गूगल स्कॉलर से शुरू कीजिए. गूगल स्कॉलर से शुरू कीजिए बबलू. गूगल स्कॉलर से शुरू कीजिए. हाउ टू नो व्हिच इज ऑथेंटिक एंड नॉट. Google Scholar will give you a very good start on that. But आजकल इतना information overload है, अगर आप Google में ही डायरेक्टली टाइप करेंगे तो आपको आपके टॉपिक पे जर्नल आर्टिकल्स भी मिलेंगे, बुक्स भी मिलेंगे, ब्लॉग्स भी मिलेंगे, कुछ रिपोर्ट्स भी मिलेंगे. उसको फिर सिफ्ट करना, उसको थोड़ा सा उसमें थोड़ा सा डिसाइड करना कि कौन सा ऑथेंटिक है कौन सा नहीं है, वो मुश्किल हो जाता है. गूगल स्कॉलर बिकॉज वो साइटेशंस के ऊपर डिपेंड करता है, वो साइटेशंस के ऊपर उससे चलता है. आपको ये भी पता चल जाएगा कि आपके जिस टॉपिक पे आपने सर्च किया उस पे सबसे ज्यादा साइटेड आर्टिकल या किताब कौन सी है. तो गूगल स्कॉलर इज बेस्ट, और गूगल स्कॉलर सब हर एक के कंप्यूटर पे अवेलेबल है. तो उसके लिए आपको कोई अलग से मेहनत भी नहीं करनी पड़ेगी, कोई पैसा भी नहीं लगाना पड़ेगा. तो गूगल स्कॉलर इज योर बेस्ट स्टार्ट. बट सिर्फ गूगल स्कॉलर पे आप बिब्लियोग्राफी नहीं बना सकते. व्हाट इज द बेस्ट वे ऑफ मेकिंग अ बिब्लियोग्राफी इज, आप गूगल स्कॉलर पे अपना कीवर्ड सर्च कीजिए, उसमें देखिए कि सबसे हाईली साइटेड आर्टिकल कौन सा है, उस आर्टिकल की बिब्लियोग्राफी देखिए और फिर पढ़िए वो सब. दिस इज कॉल्ड वर्किंग बैकवर्ड्स. सो डोंट, और दूसरी बात, डोंट लिफ्ट बिब्लियोग्राफीज. कहीं से ना बनी बनाई बिब्लियोग्राफी कभी लिफ्ट नहीं करनी चाहिए. और दूसरी ये दिस रिकमेंडेशन आई कैन नॉट गिव इनफ. आपकी बिब्लियोग्राफी में व्हेन यू हैव एंडेड योर थीसिस, एक भी रीडिंग ऐसी नहीं होनी चाहिए जो आपने खुद पढ़ी नहीं है. क्योंकि आपके डिफेंस में कोई भी क्वेश्चन किसी भी रीडिंग पे हो सकता है, वहां आपको स्टम्बल नहीं करना है. Kakasha, do you still have your hand up?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, one question he asked that annotation. I am unaware about that word. मुझे नहीं पता वो word क्या है.
Annotation का मतलब होता है कि देखिए आपने कोई रीडिंग पढ़ी, ठीक है, आपने अंडरलाइन कर ली, उसमें मार्जिन में लिख लिया कुछ, उसी को बोलते हैं एनोटेशन. उससे ऊपर और कुछ नहीं होता एनोटेशन. लेकिन उसका एक फॉर्म होता है, एनोटेशन का एक फॉर्म होता है कि आप जो पढ़ रहे हैं वो आपके रिसर्च इंटरेस्ट से कैसे रिलेट करता है.
अच्छा.
तो एनोटेशन का मतलब है कि आपने एक किताब पढ़ी या आपने एक आर्टिकल पढ़ा, आप उसका प्राइमरी आर्ग्यूमेंट नोट करके रख लीजिए. उसके लिए कोई ज्यादा मेहनत की जरूरत नहीं है. अगर आर्टिकल है और अच्छा आर्टिकल है, अच्छी जर्नल में छपा है, तो उसके एब्स्ट्रैक्ट में लिखा होगा दिस इज द पर्पस ऑफ द आर्टिकल, दिस इज द फोकस ऑफ द आर्टिकल, दिस इज व्हाट आई एम आर्ग्यूइंग, राइट. लेकिन अगर आप उसको कहीं सेव करके रख लेंगे, आपको दोबारा उस आर्टिकल को यूज करने में, रिट्रीव करने में बहुत आसानी होगी.
ओके.
ठीक है. एक ये मतलब होता है एनोटेशन का. एक दूसरा मतलब होता है एनोटेशन का कि आपने एक आर्टिकल पढ़ा, an argument that is presented in one article is contradicted or critiqued by another scholar. तो उसके ऊपर आप एक एनोटेटेड नोट बना सकते हैं कि इस टॉपिक पे इस स्कॉलर ने ये बोला है एंड ये वाला स्कॉलर ये ऐसे डिसएग्री कर रहा है. तो वो कॉन्वर्सेशन बन जाता है आपका.
ओके.
दिस इज ऑल पार्ट ऑफ राइटिंग योर लिटरेचर रिव्यू. ये सब जब आप लिटरेचर रिव्यू लिख रहे हैं, ये सब होना चाहिए. क्योंकि पढ़ते रहो 6 महीने बाद लिखने बैठो तो फिर सारा कुछ दोबारा थोड़ी ना पढ़ोगे.
जी. मुझे मैम एक जगह मुझे और प्रॉब्लम आती है. जब मैं रिसर्च पेपर्स पढ़ती हूँ ना सबके, तो मोस्टली थ्रू आउट पूरा रिसर्च पेपर पढ़ने के बाद उसने क्या फाइंडिंग्स थे सबको मिलाकर वो अपने एब्स्ट्रैक्ट्स में मेंशन करते हैं. लेकिन उस पर्टिकुलर रिसर्चर ने जिन्होंने वो क्या कहते हैं पेपर लिखा है, उसके अकॉर्डिंग उनकी कुछ डेफिनेशन भी बनती होगी. लेकिन वो मुझे समझ में नहीं आता है कि अब मैं उनका कुछ एक आर्टिकल वो पूरा जो भी नोट किया है वो मैं अपने रिव्यू पेपर में ले रही हूँ. लेकिन मैं चाहती हूँ कि उस पर्टिकुलर रिसर्चर की जिन्होंने वो लिखा है कि उसकी एक डेफिनेशन भी हो. वो हम कैसे निकाल सकते हैं?
हर किताब और हर पेपर की डेफिनेशन नहीं निकाली जा सकती. हर किताब और हर पेपर की मेजर आर्ग्यूमेंट निकाली जा सकती है.
ओके. अच्छा.
इस पेपर की मेजर आर्ग्यूमेंट क्या है, इस किताब की मेजर आर्ग्यूमेंट क्या है. और ये अगर आपको खुद से नहीं कॉन्फिडेंस आ रहा कि हैव आई अंडरस्टूड इट करेक्टली, तो ये आप अपने गाइड ये बना के ये एनोटेटेड नोट बना के अपने गाइड से पूछिए कि मैंने ये ठीक समझा क्या. ठीक है.
ओके. ठीक है. थैंक यू मैम.
Rajiv Ranjan has put his question. If someone is referencing the original author, whom do I reference? The book which I am reading or the original author?
So what you do, Rajiv, is you write the entire reference and you say cited in, and you give the page number where you have read it. Rajiv, did you get that? Azhar has raised his hand. Azhar?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am. My question is that, ma'am, how to maintain consistency while doing PhD and how to improve the writing, ma'am. Can you provide some suggestion?
How to improve, how to maintain consistency of what?
Ma'am, consistency in writing, in doing the research work in the PhD thesis, ma'am, like that.
ये तो बहुत बड़ा क्वेश्चन है सर, ये तो थोड़ा लाइफ स्किल टाइप का क्वेश्चन.
Okay.
See, I think what helps in a PhD journey is to make sure that you keep in constant touch with people from whom you need feedback. अगर आप अपने गाइड को 6 महीने में एक बार मिल रहे हैं तो वो आप ही का लॉस है. और अगर आपके गाइड के पास टाइम नहीं है मिलने का तो यू हैव टू गेट क्रिएटिव अबाउट हाउ यू सीक फीडबैक. सो रिटर्न में मत मांगिए, बोलिए सर आप मेरे को वॉइस नोट भेज दीजिए, सर आप मेरे को बुलेट पॉइंट्स में भेज दीजिए, मैम आप मेरे को या फिर वीडियो कॉल पे बता दीजिए. यू नो, क्रिएट अपॉर्चुनिटीज फॉर मेकिंग श्योर दैट यू गेट कंसिस्टेंट फीडबैक. और कंसिस्टेंट फीडबैक आपको तभी मिलेगा आप खुद कंसिस्टेंटली काम करेंगे ना. एक ही पीस ऑफ राइटिंग पे तो दोबारा फीडबैक कोई नहीं देगा. इसीलिए मैंने आपको टेबल बना के दिखाया था कि पहले साल में क्या कंप्लीट हो जाना चाहिए, दूसरे तीसरे चौथे साल में क्या कंप्लीट हो जाना चाहिए. इफ यू एंड यू ब्रेक, यू नो, within those years also I have tried to break it down for you कि पूरे साल का अपना आउटपुट नवंबर में मत देखिए. आप अपना पहला आउटपुट देखिए अप्रैल में, उसके बाद अपना देखिए जुलाई में, उसके बाद देखिए यू नो अगले क्वार्टर में. ऐसे करके कीजिए. तो कंसिस्टेंसी का यही मेरे, आई मीन इट इज वेरी इजी टू से बट दिस इज द ओनली वे टू डू इट. अगर आपने अपने 6 महीने बगैर फीडबैक के बगैर कुछ लिखे बिता दिए विदाउट एनी रीजन क्योंकि मुझे समझ नहीं आ रहा कि मैं आगे कैसे चलूं, तो फिर गेट आउट ऑफ दैट सिचुएशन. यू हैव टू गेट आउट ऑफ दैट सिचुएशन.
मैम, राइटिंग इंप्रूव करने का कुछ वेज बता दीजिए कैसे
राइटिंग इंप्रूव करने का सबसे बेस्ट तरीका है रीड एज मच एज यू कैन. जितना आप पढ़ेंगे ज्यादा आपकी राइटिंग उतनी ही इंप्रूव होगी. क्योंकि अगर आप हाई लेवल पे पढ़ेंगे आप हाई लेवल पे लिखेंगे भी. एंड डोंट आई विल से दिस टू ऑल द स्कॉलर्स हियर हु माइट हैव कंसर्न्स कि मेरी लैंग्वेज में उतनी यू नो उतनी फ्लुएंसी नहीं है. यूज AI for that. Use tools like Grammarly. Make sure that when you are writing, you write in short sentences, write in very clear, write short sentences. These are small things that you can do. Write in short sentences. लेकिन बहुत बार ऐसे होता है क्योंकि हमारी रिक्वायरमेंट है बहुत सारी यूनिवर्सिटीज की, या फिर people want to write in English कि it becomes the single most important thing. Expression becomes a single most important thing. तो उसके ऊपर फोकस मत कीजिए. आपका जो आइडियाज है उसको आप लोग को सिर्फ ट्रांसलेट करना है राइटिंग में, तो वो आप लिखिए. देन यूज सम AI टू इम्प्रूव इट. उसका ग्रामर तो इम्प्रूव हो ही जाएगा AI से, बट डोंट यूज AI टू राइट. डू नॉट डू दैट. ओके,
थैंक यू मैम.
अमिता का क्वेश्चन है रिव्यू साइटेशन कैसे करते हैं. वो तो अभी मैंने बताया. अच्छा, ओके. सो अगर आपने कहीं पढ़ा है, you have read somebody quoting somebody or somebody citing somebody in a piece of writing and you want to cite that, but you've not read the original, then you write the entire reference of the original and begin that note by writing cited in with the page number. Now people are now asking very repetitive questions. I have answered this question.
Abhishek Kumar wants to ask how to write an introduction.
Madam, I have already addressed this. So
Yes.
when I will upload this video to YouTube, so you can listen. वहाँ पर आप उस प्लेटफॉर्म पर सुन सकती है. मैंने ऑलरेडी शुरुआत में ही इंट्रोड्यूस किया है. और आई थिंक कि मैम हैव गिवन टू अस ओनली 40 to 45 minutes एंड नाउ हम लोग 1 घंटे से ज़्यादा क्रॉस कर चुके हैं. सो मैम, वन रिक्वेस्ट ऑन बिहाफ ऑफ द आर पार्टिसिपेंट्स एंड ऑन बिहाफ ऑफ द IRSA. If possible, so please provide one lecture upcoming 1 to 3 months to our participants. So वो हम लोगों के लिए ज़्यादा सही रहेगा.
वो आप जब आपको जरूरत हो आप मेरे को 2-3 महीने बाद कांटेक्ट कीजिए and then we will talk about it. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am. So Subhangi ji.
Yes.
We deeply appreciate your time and effort in making this session a valuable.